Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by, and welcome to today's webinar, Launch of the Supply Chain Index. If you're experiencing technical difficulties joining the WebEx session today, please dial 866-229-3239. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Feel free to submit written questions at any time by using the Q&A window located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Type your question into the box at the bottom and click the Send button. Please be sure to address your questions to all panelists. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the call over to your host for today's presentation, Constance Correll, Director of Marketing of Supply Chain Insight. Constance, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to today's Launch of the Supply Chain Index webinar, part of our monthly webinar series. I am your host, Constance Correll, Director of Marketing for Supply Chain Insights, and today's webinar Twitter hashtag is SCI Webinar, so please feel free to share your thoughts in the social networks. In the next hour, you will hear from Laura Ciceri, Founder and CEO, as well as Abby Mayer, Research Associate of Supply Chain Insights. They will share the very special work that has been going on for over a few years now that makes up the Supply Chain Index. Please go ahead and ask questions. We would love for you all to participate throughout the event in the Q&A section. We will compile them as we go and get to as many as possible at the end. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Laura Ciceri.
Thank you so much, Constance. It gives me great pride today to launch the Supply Chain Index. It's been 18 months in the making, and this wouldn't have happened without hard work of the team. And today I want to first set the stage by saying that the company Supply Chain Insights is a group of hardworking individuals, and our focus is on independent, actionable, and objective advice. And I hope you leave the call today feeling that we've satisfied those goals. Our goal is open research, and as we talk about the evolution of the Supply Chain Index, and we talk about why we have done it and how you can use the index with your team, we want you to share with us to make the index even stronger. It is open content research, and it only gets stronger by work with the community. I want to start by introducing my colleague, Abby Mayer. Abby joined Supply Chain Insights 16 months ago as an intern and has worked hard on the index. How are you doing this morning, Abby?
Good. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
So tell the group a little bit about your perspective on the launch today of the index and the development from your perspective.
Sure. Today is the culmination of a lot of hard work. Like you said, we've been working on this for over a year now, and I'm proud to bring it to folks.
So the index actually started in the genesis of quantitative research. We did 18 reports in 2012, and we continue to do quantitative research, 2 to 3 studies a month. And back when I was writing the book Bricks Matter, which is now on its second printing, I had actually hired Abby as a co-op student, and what I had asked Abby to do was to go through balance sheets and income statements, because my goal at the time of writing the book Bricks Matter was to try to find a correlation between public stock valuation and the supply chain ratios. I felt in my gut that I would find it. But during the year of writing Bricks Matter, I could not find a correlation. And I worked hard, and Abby and I went through spreadsheet after spreadsheet and balance sheet after balance sheet, and we weren't able at the time of the printing to really be able to define anything that we felt comfortable publishing. We're currently working on ebooks, which will have details around the Supply Chain Index we're going to show you today for 36 Morningstar sectors. And it will also include the work that we've done on the Metrics That Matter publications that have led up to this. So what Abby and I did was we started looking at industry sector by industry sector, and these reports are all published in SlideShare and on our website. And as we went through the details of each industry, we found that The value proposition within the industries were quite different. The trends were quite different. And I want to give you a bird's eye view of some of these key learnings. Now, this learning is actually culminating in a couple of different events for us. First of all, we're offering public training where we share insights on what these correlations look like and the evolution of supply chain excellence. Secondly, we are on a countdown for our global summit, which will be at the Phoenician in September, which will actually have presentations by each industry sector on how they achieved supply chain excellence and drove these results. And we're also providing podcasts, 7 to 8 a month, which are free for download through iTunes on our website. We want you to join us to celebrate and to share this information. So let's start. You know, I've been an industry analyst for 9 years, and I've been in search of what defines supply chain excellence. I find that most teams really want to do the right thing, but in our quantitative research, we find one of the biggest barriers for driving forward is lack of clarity at the executive team on supply chain excellence. So this work was really to say, what drives best in class? It is our belief that best-in-class companies perform better than peer group. I do not believe you can put all industries in a spreadsheet and shake them up. The value proposition for automotive is just too different than food and beverage than retail. I also believe that you see distinct patterns in year-over-year results, and you can't look at 1 to 2 or 3 year snapshots. You really got to look at company performance over time. And it's alignment in metrics because supply chains are complex systems, and we have to look at portfolios of metrics. But also, it revolves around conscious choice, that supply chain excellence is performance against a business strategy and consistency in being able to hit those targets. And I find leaders manage trade-offs very well in these complex systems, whereas laggards let the systems whip them around. And so to basically start the work, when I hired Abby, I had Abby manually getting information off of balance sheets and income statements and starting to build a database of 20 years of financial ratios. And this statement that a supply chain is a complex system with complex processes and with increasing complexity is something that I wrote a lot about in Bricks Matter, but as you see in the evolution of the index, it really comes to light because this complex system cannot just be seen in two-dimensional graphs or in a spreadsheet. It really requires us to do hard work to understand what I call the effective frontier. And I'm deliberate here in that I don't call it the efficient frontier because I think that the efficient supply chain is not the most effective, and the efficient supply chain for most companies is the lowest cost per case and the shortest cycles. And instead, I think it requires companies to have a trade-off of revenue and cost of goods and trade off working capital and cycles and look at the new impacts of corporate social responsibility and what we're doing with assets. And when we do that, I think that then we can look at our policies for channel and product and suppliers and trade off forecast accuracy, customer service, and inventory. But in the writing of the book, Bricks Matter, I couldn't find good data for forecast accuracy. It's only lately that there are 2 sources for forecast accuracy, and it only goes back over a couple of years. I could not find good numbers for customer service, but what I could find was information on the balance sheet and income statements that allowed me to build the database to look at financial ratio data over this period of time. And initially, we started looking at it by SIC codes. Poor Abby spent months pouring through and building the database. Abby, tell the group how you did it.
We started over a year ago looking at annual reports and 10K statements and trying to come up with a standardized way to report financial data and how to organize that within the spreadsheets. And so we came up with a methodology to split financial metrics into 4 different categories of growth, profitability, cycle, and complexity that help us to understand the effective frontier and that help to organize that raw data collection that took so long.
And Abby, I think one of the breakthroughs for me was when we stopped looking at absolute numbers and started looking at ratios, because that took the issues out of currency and small companies versus large companies. To me, that was a breakthrough for us.
I would agree. I think, you know, we made several steps and improvements throughout the process, and one of them was moving towards ratios away from raw numbers, because that alleviated a lot of the concerns about different sized companies and different currencies.
So as we did this, what we organized in our community was the ability for companies to ask us for benchmark data in this area. And in fact, if anyone's listening and would like to request free benchmarking like the kind I'm going to show you today, we do this for free for 5 different cuts of data. And as companies learn, we learn also. So let me show you some examples, and let's start with the definition. So as we moved along with this, we said, let's get clear on the definition. So today, what we're going to talk about is the supply chain index. And we're going to show you a formulaic representation of supply chain financial ratios, which I showed you the ratios before, which we organized into growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And we correlated using the ratios to stock market capitalization, actually building a formula based upon linear and nonlinear regression. Now, it is our belief from this research that every supply chain has an effective frontier, and the effective frontier is the correct balance of growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And what we do through the evolution and adoption of supply chain processes is we build the potential of the supply chain to increase the ability to produce through demand and supply volatility, and to basically weather market-to-market storms, but also over time to show improvements in the potential. It's a choice whether or not companies move on the effective frontier to maximize companies' market valuation. What we want to do today is share what that will look like, but we don't necessarily have to adopt that. But the choice around supply chain excellence is the alignment of the company to maximize the value based upon the business strategy, based upon the financial ratios, to basically align the metrics that matter. And one of the issues and the purpose of this research is to say which metrics matter for each industry and to not generalize it any longer. Now, if we look at history, when I wrote the book Bricks Matter, I thought that we had improved inventory and improved customer service, but also what I found was that the only thing we've really improved is progress and productivity. And when you look at the individual industries, you can see that the chemical and consumer products companies have outpaced the other industries on improvement in productivity. And there are 3 reasons for this. One is what people have done in outsourcing. The second is the fit of technologies and processes for the front office. Chemical and consumer electronics have done a better job of alignment in the front offices and sales and marketing. And third is the evolution of supply chain processes. But overall, we can see that all industries improve productivity. But when we look at cross-functional views of industry, what we were looking at was, first of all, how resilient had they been? And so we could see productivity. We could see that the companies that had matured to the greatest degree were more resilient. When you look at the downturn of the Great Recession, pharmaceutical industries had curves much like what you see by Merck. And Zimmer Holdings, medical device companies, are not as mature in supply chain processes, also showed greater patterns of distortion through these downturns. And we also looked at company performance within a sector, and I'll show you a couple of these charts. But one of the things we learned was we could only look at the intersection of 2 of the columns. In this case, it was a cycle comparison against a profitability comparison. And this actually shows that Colgate outperformed the peer group for this particular intersection. But when you change the intersection, then you have a question about what really defines supply chain excellence. It also shows that certain companies made progress, like Colgate or Procter & Gamble or Kimberly-Clark, but other industries went backwards, like Kraft or Unilever, and so we've been studying these trends. And as we look at this, we're also looking at value chains, and this is an example of healthcare value chain metrics where we're actually looking at what did industries average over the last decade and how have they contributed differently. And it's been very interesting, and this was really the preliminary information for us to begin the work on the supply chain index. This was where we cut our teeth and did our learnings to understand what drives value in a value chain and what drives value for each individual industry. So the work that Abby and the team have been working on is to take this a step further. And what we did was we went to find what formulas and which ratios actually maximize market valuation in public markets, and how does that tie to supply chain excellence. And that's what we want to share with you today. So first of all, Abby, tell me a little bit about the index. What does this mean to you, and how did you go about developing it?
The supply chain index is our attempt to connect market capitalization and performance in the stock market with supply chain excellence. And like I said earlier, we've divided supply chain excellence into those 4 categories of growth, profitability, cycle, and complexity, and understanding how companies are actively managing those 4 levers and what effect that's going to have on their performance in the stock market.
And, you know, as we went about this and we got the balance sheet information and we started to actually go about looking at the peer groups and connecting the financial information to excellence, what did you learn, Abby?
Well, I think there's a lot of lessons in this, and it's still an ongoing process. But really the reason that we started doing this in the first place was to try to create an objective system, because the whole supply chain index is based purely on mathematical relationships. And so we've taken subjectivity out of it and trying to connect financial performance to supply chain excellence. The other point I think I've learned is that we still have evolving best practices. And so in an effort to better understand that, looking to the future, we'll be using the index to connect index performance versus quantitative survey results to understand what those leading index companies are doing and how we can learn from them and raise the industry to the next level.
And, you know, we can't talk about what it is without talking about what it's not, right, Abby? So let's just get real clear on that. People listening on the phone, how should they use what we're going to show them, and where should they exercise caution?
The index is a way to understand a company's supply chain relative to a specific peer group within an industry sector. And like I said, it's based on those inputs of market capitalization and the supply chain ratios. It's not a way to look at overall company performance or to compare the results of the model with actual market capitalization data, which you might be able to pull from Bloomberg or Yahoo Finance.
So, you know, let's talk about the evolution because, you know, Abby, this has been, you know, a year and a half of hard work. Our initial work was really focusing on industry sectors by SIC code, and then we moved to the Morningstar sectors, and we're actually going to share 3 of the sectors today. Tell me a little bit about why did we move from SIC codes to Morningstar sectors?
Sure. The program that we use to access the financial information is organized around Morningstar sectors, and so that was a way to really create comprehensive and holistic peer groups. And so that's why we've chosen to go with Morningstar sectors, and we'll be presenting throughout this summer additional industries based on Morningstar sectors.
And for the group, what is a Morningstar sector, Abby?
Yeah, so Morningstar is a company that provides financial information, and they've categorized companies into different buckets. For example, the ones we're going to go through today are consumer packaged goods, mass retailers, and chemical companies.
So it's very granular, and often we have conglomerates, and they can be put into different buckets. But in the shifting of this from SIC codes to Morningstar Sectors, we're actually going to be redoing some of the reports, and over the summer we're going to actually be sharing information about 36 Morningstar Sectors like you're going to see today, and we're actually going to be tying that to value chains like you're going to see today. And we're going to culminate this information in our global summit with speakers based upon the index. And how long does it take you, Abby, to actually do a formula on a sector?
It's still a learning process, but it takes about a week per industry at this point to find the data, come up with an equation, and then do a 2012 ranking.
Okay. And so let's talk about how did we do this. So tell the group about the methodology.
We started with data collection, and like I said, that stretched for several months. And from that, we were able to identify about 50 financial metrics. And from that list, we narrowed it down to 14 specific supply chain ratios. And that decision was based upon excluding raw numbers, excluding financial metrics that might not be meaningful in the supply chain space. And then we took those metrics and we used regression analysis to come up with an industry equation, correlating the supply chain metrics to market capitalization. And then the fifth step is we plugged in 2012 company results to that industry equation, and we were able to rank the companies from largest to smallest based upon their performance with the model. And then the final steps, step 6 and step 7 on this slide, we'll be analyzing that peer group looking back historically all the way back to 2000, and we'll be expanding the use of the index to connect to our quantitative research and to bring more clarity to the whole industry.
So Abby, as I've worked with you on this, a couple of things I've learned was, first of all, raw numbers versus financial ratios. I mean, it is just a major leap forward when you do that. And the second is the complexity of the data. I mean, you gave me spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and I just couldn't see the patterns that we're going to share today because it's such a complex system. And then the third thing is just how unique each industry is. Those were my learnings. How about yourself?
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of times we talk about best practices and we think that that's meaningful across industry peer groups. And what I've learned is that every industry has its own challenges and its own opportunities, and we need to look at them individually to understand what makes a good supply chain.
And the other thing that I've really learned from this is which metrics matter in terms of driving financial valuations. And so while our rankings may not actually represent supply chain excellence, in other words, at the core, the company could have better supply chain practices, they may not be aligned. And I think one of my biggest learnings on this is which metrics really matter in this valuation. Anything else, Abby, before we move on here?
Yeah, I think that's an important point to get to really the financial understanding and that mathematical basis of which metrics are meaningful.
And the other thing, Abby, that really shocked me, because we've been doing these studies for 50 companies now in the community, is how few companies have actually looked at the data, their own data or their peer group data. It's just hard to get, and how few companies have actually tied themselves to their balance sheet numbers. Has that surprised you as well?
It has. Like I said, all of this information is available for all publicly traded companies, and so it actually comes from each company's annual report. But most folks are surprised that's where it comes from. It's just, even though it's out there, it's not very accessible for people to use.
So let's go through the steps now. Let's look at how we progressed in the building of the index. So the data sources, let's just talk about where did you get the data?
The market capitalization data comes from a website called ycharts.com, and that comes, we started with 2006 quarter 1 to 2012 quarter 4. So we've used quarterly data over 6 years to come up with 24 different time periods. Like we mentioned earlier, the industry peer groups are defined by Morningstar Sectors, and we'll be adding to that to through the summer to get up to a total of 36. And the financial ratios are built from balance sheet and income statement data, which we collect from one source.
Okay. And we've built that in a database and SQL queries. You've gotten so good at it from not being able to do one at all. I'm so proud of you. But how did we go back through those many financial ratios to really narrow it down to these 4 core supply chain ratios that we did the regression analysis? Tell the group how we picked these.
Well, this was a process of excluding all raw numbers. We ran some correlations and we found that when there were extremely large companies, they had a significant advantage. And so instead of using a raw number in terms of revenue, we decided to use revenue growth because that was fair across the sizes. We also excluded numbers that weren't directly applicable to supply chain, and we excluded numbers which were multiples. So you'll notice a lot of inventory metrics within the cycle column, and we decided to only use days of inventory. Finally, we really wanted to use revenue per employee as a measure of complexity, but it's just not available as often as we need it to be. It's not reliable. So unfortunately, some metrics we don't have a reliable enough source to be able to use them within our 14 ratios.
Now, Abby, let's just go through some basics here on the definition. You know, what's the difference between return on assets, return on invested capital, and return on net assets for people that, you know, may not have sat on the front row of their finance class?
Yeah, some of these metrics are going to be really familiar to people and some of them aren't going to be. So return on assets is probably the most familiar, and that's just net income over total assets. When we look at return on invested capital, that takes into account property, plant, and equipment, and it subtracts out current liabilities. Excuse me, that's return on net assets. And then return on invested capital takes into account the shareholders' equity within the firm.
Okay, and so there are different measurements, and you know what I find is most supply chains are looking at return on assets, but not necessarily some of the other metrics. So, okay, Abby, are you ready to get to it? Let's reveal what we found. So what we did find was growth didn't correlate. So this is actually the chemical sector, and we were looking at market capitalization versus revenue growth. And this shocked me that we've not found any of our formulas to actually see the correlation of growth. Was this a surprise to you?
It was. And I think every equation has been a surprise to find out which metrics matter. But it was surprising that revenue growth didn't seem to have any either linear or nonlinear relationship to market capitalization performance.
I was shocked. And then when we looked at the individual sectors, you know, in my gut, Abby, I've just always felt that when we look at a value network, which this is a mass retailer like Walmart or Target, a consumer packaged goods company like Procter & Gamble or Colgate, and a chemical industry, that the metrics that mattered would be very different. And as we built these formulas, which have very significant correlations on their R factors, you know, I was surprised to see the metrics that mattered were so different by industry. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think here we'll see that operating margin, for example, is meaningful across all 3 industries, and it's the same with days of inventory. And I've tried to bring that out by bolding those specific metrics. But each industry does have a very different mix of metrics.
And the metrics that matter. So if they're not on this chart, they weren't significant?
Correct. So if they aren't on this chart, they didn't have a strong enough linear or nonlinear relationship with market capitalization to be included in our equation.
Okay. Let's take the first equation. So mass retail. Talk about what this equation represents.
So mass retail, this is the equation outlined in red. We have the natural log of market capitalization, and then we have 4 different metrics, 5, operating margin, which I've abbreviated OM, working capital, return on invested capital, the DPO-DSO ratio, and days of inventory.
Okay. And when we look at that by individual companies, we saw some strong differences. what did you see in this particular ranking? Because here we've got the absolute numbers and then we've got the equation output. How should people look at this chart?
So you'll see days of inventory, DPO over DSO, operating margin, return on invested capital, and working capital ratio. The numbers in those columns are the raw performance of those companies during the year 2012. And then on the far right-hand column, we'll see the equation output, and that's the result that we got by plugging in those 2012 numbers. And you'll see that Walmart is ranked number 1. But I think it's interesting here to notice that Costco, which is ranked number 3, actually has the lowest days of inventory. And so I think this just goes back to the understanding of it's a complex system. We can't just look at 1 or 2 metrics. You have to take all of them into account.
And that's so hard to do without this kind of analysis, you know? And then if we look at consumer packaged goods, which is it's the most complex of any of the formulas. Let's talk about what that looks like.
Right. I think what we see here is that one of the most complex formulas is also for one of the most advanced industries. CPG is often mentioned as one of the most mature supply chain industries. And so what we have here is the same sort of process, but with different metrics and different companies. And so the result is that we have different X variables. Operating margin occurs in both retail and consumer packaged goods, but we have other metrics like free cash flow or SG&A over COGS that are just meaningful for CPG companies.
And one of the interesting things, and you know, Abby, I've followed this industry for a long time, is the SG&A over cost of goods sold. You know, we've actually been growing employees in the front office of consumer products, and you know, that's actually a big factor here. And so as we look at the evolution of this industry, I found the rankings to be very interesting. And again, you know, this complex system, how fascinating.
Yeah, if we look at this slide, you'll see that Procter & Gamble has the best performance in the equation, and so they come out ranked number 1. But if you look across at their performance on individual metrics, they actually have the lowest return on invested capital. And I think that gets back to that same point I mentioned earlier, that it's impossible to measure a supply chain by only 1 or 2 metrics.
You know, and I've done a lot of writing. You know, remember Bricks Matter, the pioneers picked Procter & Gamble as the best company in terms of supply chain excellence. You know, and I've had a lot of discussion with Colgate, which has had the best return on assets and the best operating margin. And it's interesting here to see the impact of things like days of inventory and the differences that we see in some of the other metrics. I found this to be fascinating. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I think this table enables really a comprehensive look. And you'll notice that there's a lot of work done on return on assets within consumer packaged goods. However, our equation doesn't even consider that because it didn't have a significant enough correlation.
So some of the metrics that we think matter don't really matter, right?
Probably, yeah.
If this is what we're trying to measure. And now let's take the chemical industry, which is so very different than the other 2 industries. So if we look at this, what did you find out here?
So the chemical industry has the simplest equation, and it also has a large role for return on assets, which is, I think, a popular metric that hadn't proved meaningful for CPG or retail.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we go through and we look at this, because, you know, we're actually looking at all public companies versus just the Fortune 1000, I think it's interesting to see that some companies that most people don't even think of, right, are actually coming up to the top. And when we look at the individual ranking numbers, again, this complex system, this is actually an industry that we said was very hard to see just off of a balance sheet, that we weren't clear who was the winner. But there is a pattern here.
Right, and we do see a pattern, and I think a lot of less familiar companies pop to the top of chemical, which was surprising to me as well.
Right, and you know, so I think it's a fascinating way for us to look at research. And You know, we're only 3 of the 36 that we're launching today, and we're actually in progress of the food industry, and we wanted to give people kind of a sneak peek to the food industry. First of all, what is the food industry, Abby, in the Morningstar sector?
Yep, so the food industry composes about 50 companies within Morningstar. It includes a lot of the really large companies we would think of, Kellogg, Kraft, General Mills, and then some smaller ones too, to put them all on an equal playing field.
And, you know, you're not done yet. Tell us where you are in this particular analysis.
So we have the equation for the food industry, which you'll see outlined in green there. And you'll also notice that there's a couple metrics here that haven't shown up previously, and that one Z is the Altman Z ratio, which is a predictor of likelihood of bankruptcy within the next 2 years. And we're currently in the process of ranking those food companies for 2012 performance using this equation.
So here we have actually a risk metric that we haven't seen in other industries, and I find this very, very fascinating. It's also a more complex equation than chemical and in some degree the consumer packaged goods associated industry. I think a lot of times people talk about CPG and food and beverage together, but they're very different, aren't they?
Yes.
Well, Abby, I am so excited by the work. I know you've just been working many long hours. I want to talk next about how people can use the data and where we're headed with it as a company. First of all, one of the things that we're going to be writing about over the summer is the value chain. So this is an example of a consumer value chain and how different the formulas are for driving market valuations. And what we're going to be writing about is how companies within each of the Morningstar sectors have changed over the last decade, and also how the value chain has changed over the last decade, and what this means in terms of key insights around how we drive collaboration. Because I think we don't really have a win-win relationship until we can align on value, and it's my hope that this helps companies within a Morningstar sector to better align on metrics organizationally, but also to better align in top-to-top meetings about how they can win together. The other thing we are going to be doing in our quantitative research, because we know the industry and because we have the index, we're now going to start to go back through the quantitative studies that we've done, and we're going to be looking at things like organizational design or process maturity, and we're going to be able to correlate metrics that matter to process and organizational maturity. This is something that will evolve over time, and as we do new studies and as companies take the new studies, and of course we keep everyone's information confidential, we will be doing more correlations on the metrics that matter to process and organizational maturity. The other thing is, you know, as we think about this, what we're hoping to do is to elevate thinking. We believe strongly, and we believed it when we began, and we believe it even firmly or more firmly now, that value and what drives value in each industry is very, very different. I think it, you know, negates any methodology that tries to compare industry against industry in the same balance sheet or the same Excel spreadsheet. But the other thing that I really took away from this was that public markets reward supply chain balance and alignment. When you look at the numbers, you cannot drive operating margin or days of inventory or days of payable without alignment. And so as companies think about the building of horizontal processes and the definition of what defines supply chain excellence, we can't just start with process. We have to start with what do we value in the supply chain strategy and which metrics matter and how do we align for balance and alignment against that. And we can't just look at 1 or 2 metrics in isolation. We've got to keep in mind it's a complex system and it has to be carefully defined. And I think that's really key for most companies, is that it really requires some deep thought around what drives strategy and how do we make trade-offs, because I find that there's no substitute for leadership, and it's about conscious trade-offs. But at the end, I really firmly believe supply chain excellence matters. And it's our hope today that this kind of research can help you to be better aligned, to have the discussion within your organization around why it matters. And so what we would love to have you do is help us to elevate the discussion. We are going to have this data available in the community. We want to hear from you. We want a hearty debate. We don't want this just to be a sole voice. We want companies to come in, ask for their benchmark data. We do that for free. Have debates with us. Let us talk to your financial teams. We want you to come together to share your insights at our global summit. The leaders over the last decade on the Supply Chain Index will be presenting. We will be asking them to present and to talk about the metrics that matter. And we want to build the next generation of supply chain research using the index so that we can help companies power off of a plateau that we're seeing where they're not able to improve margin and drive cycles in the face of complexity. And we want to leverage our learnings to help people to really drive insights on these processes, what we do with people, because I really believe talent is the missing link of the supply chain and technology decisions. This is part of our webinar series. We have past webinars that are available on demand where we talked about the early work, and in our upcoming webinars around healthcare and sales and operations planning and big data and talent and digital manufacturing, we will start to correlate the indexes, and we'll also be rolling out through the summer additional formulas on the Morningstar Index sectors. And this data will be available in our community, in our private networking, and also when we launch our supply chain superheroes and gamification in the summer. And we encourage you to come, share your voice. The actual data that we shared today will be in the Educate section of this particular community, so you can see the Supply Chain Index, where you will find Abby, you will find the data. Please share it freely. And with that, I just want to close. Constance, what questions do we have today?
Great. Laura, Abby, thank you so much. And we do have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, what did you find most surprising through your work on this project? Laura and Abby?
Abby, I'm going to let you go first on that.
Okay. You know, supply chain is about 30 years old, and when I was in school, I always thought it was really highly evolved, and we knew what was the best things to do, and we knew what we were doing. And through this research, I've really found we've got a lot of work to do. We don't know what metrics matter, and we don't always have best practices, and so that's what's been illuminating for me.
Constance, what was really amazing to me was going through this whole experience. You know, I was naive to think I could take 2 or 3 ratios that I really believed in, like days of inventory or return on assets or operating margin, and determine supply chain excellence. And I originally thought, sitting at my kitchen table, that I could do these correlations pretty easily in the writing of Bricks Matter, and I was very frustrated over the 12-month period. I wasn't able to get it done. And it was really required me to develop this methodology and to keep pushing against it. It's hard work, and I was surprised how hard it was.
Sure. It was like 2 years in the making. What was your original timeline for this to release?
I was naive enough to think I could do it in 3 months, right? And,
right.
you know, poor Abby I hired and started doing the manual tabs on, you know, the balance sheet information, and you know, I tried to get a couple of really bright statisticians to help me, and it really required building the database so I had enough frequency of information to be able to make this work, and then being able to find the market valuation data. And so it required evolution of the process, learning that we needed to use the ratios, building the database, doing the queries, putting the resources on it. It was not easy, and I think Abby and the team are to be commended for the hard work that they did.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay, so our next question is, did you rate the metrics to the 5 different stages as distinguished in your book, Brooks Matter? This is for Laura.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it? Did I?
Sure. Did you rate the metrics to the 5 different stages as distinguished in your book, Brooks Matter?
Oh, the evolution of supply chain processes. Well, that is what we're going to be doing in the next phase across the summer. So each of the quantitative studies that we've done actually carry with it a maturity model. And that's the next step for us to go back and look at supply chain maturity based upon the model in Brooks Matter, which looks at, first we had the efficient supply chain, then we had to balance it with customer service, then we had to build resiliency, then we tried to become demand-driven, and then the next stage, which I call market-driven, it'll actually look at the evolution of supply chain practices around those maturity models to be able to look at the correlation back to these metrics. That will take us some time, though.
Great. Okay, could you please explain what is the metric Altman Z?
Abby, Altman Z.
Yeah, Altman Z is a metric that's been around for about 30 years. It was invented by a finance professor, and it uses 8 raw metrics that it pulls from a balance sheet and an income statement, and it predicts the likelihood of bankruptcy within the next 2 years of a company.
Great. Okay, Abby, thank you so much. Okay, next question. Is there any correspondence or relationship between your SC ratios and supply chain index and one or more supply chain process standards, let's say SCC or SCORE?
We don't know yet. I believe that the SCORE model, and I used to sit on the SCORE board, actually is a wonderful way to define process. But I think that the metrics that matter that we're using here are very different than the SCORE metrics, and I think that the SCORE model could be updated to basically align with these metrics. It is my goal to gift this research to any organization that is interested in updating processes or models. So I don't think we know yet. We're not done with the work, but I really look forward to working with organizations to help them with what we learn in this research.
Great. So what other industries will we be including in the index? What can we look forward to in the next couple of months?
So Abby, you want to talk about the other Morningstar sectors and how we're going to roll this out?
Through the summer, we'll be adding to the industries, and there's about 150 Morningstar sectors selected at this point, 36. So we're including some like investment banking or insurance companies. We won't be ranking those on supply chain, but we'll be ranking everything from apparel to consumer electronics, semiconductors, automotive, a wide swath of industries.
So we'll actually see the healthcare index for our May 9th webinar when people want to tune into that. And we have a May report on apparel that will be coming out that will start to look at the apparel value chain. And over the summer, we will start to really move through the discrete industries. And, you know, the Morningstar sectors are available in the Educate sector if someone wants to go and see what we're going to be doing. We really want to hear from people and to validate or to question the process.
Great. So this is a question, how can I use the index to improve my business?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me, and Abby, please chime in, is, you know, it's useful to see which metrics matter in correlation to public valuation because I think that's very helpful in alignment of the supply chain team with the financial team. So many times I see companies measuring so many things that they get lost in the metrics, and so I think the correlations actually help. And I think also the relative strengths based upon the factors in front of the correlations actually help the people to better align. Unfortunately, I think that you know, we haven't been as focused as we could be around that. And I think while people really want to support market valuations, they aren't clear. So it's my hope that this helps with alignment between functions. Abby, thoughts?
I think another opportunity is working outside of the organization, so understanding what downstream partners and upstream partners are worried about and what their equation means to them and how we can better coordinate end to end.
I think that's excellent. And then the third thing I think is people go to conferences and they hear all the discussions around supply chain excellence. I think it's important to have a lens around what drives metrics that matter by industry because, you know, we just can't generalize in broad brush industries.
Great. So Laura and Abby, it looks like we are approaching the top of the hour, and we still have a couple of minutes to take some more questions, but I just want to ask the both of you in closing, how do you sum this up? This is a pretty special day, the launch of the Supply Chain Index. What are your last words to sum this webinar up?
Well, it's my hope that people use this as a starting point, not an ending point, that we're launching a big step in sharing the research that we have done. But as we learn more about industries we want to share openly, we want to shift the organizational thinking from we have supply chain best practices to we have evolving practices. We want to help drive alignment cross-functionally, and we really want to power the next generation of supply chain organizations, processes, and technologies, and to be far more objective on why supply chain matters. And it's my hope that this research can do that. Abby, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the index is a great opportunity to have open dialogue, and so I would encourage people to join the community and to come talk about the rankings and disagreements or agreements they have with the equation so that we can build a stronger model moving forward.
Great. Well, I am certainly so proud to be part of this wonderful team and the launch of the Supply Chain Index, and I want to thank Laura and Abby for presenting the Supply Chain Index today, and I want to thank you all for participating in this special moment with us. I encourage all of you to join the conversation over in our Supply Chain Insights community in the Supply Chain Index space. This is just the beginning, and we want to hear from you. We want a healthy debate in the true spirit of open content research. Ask your CFO and financial group to review what has been done and tell us what you think. As we progress, we will add new industries. So connect with Laura, Abby, and myself in the community if you've not done so already. That's supplychaininsightscommunity.com. Our next webinar is May 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, How Do We Heal the Healthcare Value Chain, Part 2. And you can register for this on our website, supplychaininsights.com. I hope you can all join us for that one. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you on May 9th, and have a great day.